The cold has been there all morning, so has she. Picture this. You're at the edge of a river before the sun has properly arrived, and the cold of the stone is already working its way through the fabric at your knees. The water is still. The mist sits low across it, unmoving, like it can't decide whether to rise or settle back down. The only sounds are the current, and the birds just starting to wake, and the slow, rhythmic pull of wet linen against stone. There's a woman here. She's been here since before 5. She's washing clothes in water cold enough to make her hands ache, and she's doing it with the steadiness of someone who doesn't waste energy on feeling sorry for herself. Her back is straight. Her face is calm. She does not look up. Here's what most people don't know about Regency England. In the early 1800s, there were no identity papers for internal travel. None at all. A duke could ride into an unfamiliar county in plain clothes, give a different name at the inn, and nobody had any legal way to expose him. Not a magistrate, not a vicar, not a single neighbour. Your rank was your word and nothing else. Which meant the most powerful men in England could, if they chose, simply disappear. One of them chose this river. What he found here would cost him everything he thought he was protecting. This is the story of Eleanor Hale. Eleanor didn't arrive in the world with any particular drama. She was born in the ordinary way that most Regency children were. In a bed, in a house that wasn't large, in a county that wasn't fashionable. Her father was a solicitor, not a labourer, not a landowner. Somewhere in between, in that respectable middle ground that Regency England produced in quiet abundance. He wore decent coats, knew Latin, and had married a woman he loved, which at the time was considered either romantic or mildly impractical, depending on who you asked. What her parents had, more than money, was legitimacy. They were married in the parish church. Eleanor's birth was recorded in the ledger. Full name, parents' names, date of their marriage, all of it set down in neat ink by the parish clerk. The kind of paperwork that nobody thinks about until they need it. They didn't know they'd need it. They had no reason to think they ever would. They died when Eleanor was 7. There's no romantic version of how that goes. In a Regency household, illness arrived fast and left slowly, and it didn't arrange itself around the convenience of the children it left behind. Eleanor was 7 years old, and then she was alone, and the world around her immediately began calculating what to do with her. In Regency England, orphaned legitimate children didn't simply fall into the void. There was a system, not a generous one, but a system. The legal responsibility fell to the home parish. The parish could place a child with a tradesman, a clergyman, or, in the worst cases, the workhouse. What it couldn't easily do was override the claim of a blood relative who stepped forward. And blood relatives had a way of stepping forward when there was something to gain. Eleanor's aunt stepped forward, her father's sister. She took Eleanor in, which was the decent thing to do. She also put Eleanor to work as a domestic servant in her own home, which was not what taking a child in was supposed to mean, legally or morally. But it was distressingly common in this period for orphaned girls with no wealthy advocate. A genuine servant had a wage and a clear position. A dependent relation had the protection of family feeling, theoretically. What Eleanor had was neither. She did the work of a servant and received the standing of a relation, which is to say she received nothing at all. No wage, no introduction, no future. Here's what made Eleanor's situation particular, rather than just sad. She was legitimate. Her birth was documented. Her father had been a respectable man of a respectable profession. By the legal and social logic of the time, she should have had access to the marriage market. Modest access, yes, given her reduced circumstances, but access. Young women of a solicitor's background, if they were presentable, literate, and had someone willing to introduce them, could find suitable matches. What they needed was a sponsor, someone to say, "This woman's origins are verified, her character is known, she is of good family." Eleanor's aunt said nothing about Eleanor's origins at all. It was a deliberate silence, the kind that costs nothing and gains everything. Because in a church ledger in the nearby market town, the ink was still sitting there. Eleanor's birth record, her parents' marriage record, every piece of documentation that proved exactly who she was and what she was owed. Her aunt knew about that ledger. She had known since the week she took Eleanor in. She chose not to mention it, and that choice kept Eleanor exactly where she was most useful, in the house, in the kitchen, at the river before dawn, with no visible path forward and no apparent reason why. If you've made it this far into the evening, I'm glad you're here. While Eleanor's story settles around you, drop a comment and tell me this. Was there ever something you knew was rightfully yours, but couldn't quite reach? I find people's answers to that genuinely moving. Tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what time it is there. If these stories are the company you want at the end of your day, a subscription means they'll find you again. And whenever you're ready, let the room go quiet. Eleanor's still at the river. We haven't missed anything. Hannah More, the writer and philanthropist who spent decades in the late 1700s and early 1800s documenting the lives of working women across England, wrote about a quality she kept encountering in women who carried the heaviest burdens, a quality she could only call interior dignity. Not pride, which is performed, not resignation, which is defeat. Something quieter and more permanent than either, the quality of a person who knows what she is, even when the world around her has decided not to notice. Eleanor had that quality. Her aunt noticed it without naming it, and found it, quietly, infuriating. The house was not cruel in a dramatic way. Eleanor wasn't underfed or locked away. The cruelty was quieter, the kind that operates through a mission. She wasn't introduced to visitors. She wasn't included in social calls. When the local quarterly assembly held its dance, Eleanor wasn't there. When other young women her age were beginning to be seen, beginning to be considered, Eleanor was kept at the edges. Day after day, the same steady message: you don't quite count. She was 17 when the story properly begins. She'd been at her aunt's house for 10 years. She knew every room the way you know things you've cleaned rather than loved. She knew which stair creaked and which window let in the draught. She knew the garden in all 4 seasons, not because she'd enjoyed it, but because she'd weeded it. She knew the river very well indeed. Laundry in Regency England was not a weekly event. That's worth staying with, because the instinct is to picture something regular and manageable, a household with a rhythm. But the reality was considerably harder than that. The process was so disruptive, so labour-intensive, that most families spread it out over weeks, every 2 or 3 weeks, sometimes longer. And when wash day came, it wasn't a day. It was several days of soaking, boiling, scrubbing, rinsing, wringing and drying, every single step done by hand, beginning to end. The lye soap came first. It was cheap and effective, and it burned. Made from wood ash and water, concentrated enough to eat through fabric stains and as a predictable side effect through skin. Women who did laundry regularly had cracked, reddened hands, not occasionally but permanently. Eleanor had had hands like that since she was 12. Before she could carry the linen to the river, she had to haul water. There were no taps. There was the well or the pump, or the river itself, carried in heavy buckets, 2 at a time, as many trips as it took to fill the copper vat. Then the fire had to be built underneath it, then the soaking, then the boiling, then the pulling of steaming cloth that had to be dragged down to the bank where the scrubbing could begin. Her knuckles went red against the stone. The cold reached up through her dress from below, and the steam reached down through the morning air from the vat she'd left behind. In cold weather, which in England is most of the year, this meant working with wet hands in air that didn't warm them. By the time the sun was fully over the tree line, Eleanor had already been working for 3 hours. But here's the thing about the river at dawn that doesn't fit neatly into an account of hardship. It was also the only hour that felt like hers. Nobody was there. The mist was still. The birds were building their sound slowly, note by note. Between the rhythms of scrubbing and rinsing in the particular quiet of early water, there was space for something her aunt's house never allowed: the freedom to think without being directed, to exist without being useful to someone else. She was 17. She was capable and considerably more literate than her situation implied. Her father had taught her to read before he died, and she'd quietly continued on her own, borrowing from the household shelves without being told she could. She understood her circumstances with the particular clarity that is in some ways worse than confusion. She knew something was being withheld. She couldn't prove it yet. The servant's invisibility rule extended to more than eyes and footsteps. It extended to ambition, to opinion, to the expression of any inner life that might inconvenience the household that contained it. Young women in service were expected to move through a family's space like weather, present, necessary, never remarked upon. What they thought, what they wanted, what they knew about themselves, these were private matters that had no practical outlet and no socially acceptable audience. Eleanor's outlet was the river, not the washing of it specifically, the being there. The pre-dawn hour when the county was still asleep and the water was doing what water does without being asked. She'd come to think of those early mornings as a kind of accounting, a quiet reckoning of what she knew to be true about herself, regardless of what anyone around her seemed to believe. She was not nothing. She had a name. She had a father who had loved her. She had a record somewhere of exactly who she was. In a church in a market town not far from where she knelt, a ledger sat on a shelf. It had sat there for 10 years. Inside it was her name, her parents' names, the date of their lawful marriage. All of it still there, all of it still waiting. And on a particular morning, on a particular stretch of river, hoofbeats slowed on the far bank. She did not look up, but she heard them stop. The hoofbeats had come from the East Road, which meant the rider had been travelling before dawn, which meant he was either a working man or someone with a reason to be unseen. Eleanor had learned, over years of early mornings, to catalogue sounds at the river. She knew the difference between a cart horse and a riding horse, between a local farmer and a stranger. The sound that had just reached her was neither. She kept scrubbing. There's a particular discipline in not looking up. It's one of the first things a servant learns, and one of the last things she forgets. You develop a peripheral awareness instead, a sensitivity to sound and movement, a way of knowing the room without turning toward it. Eleanor knew without looking that the horse had stopped. She knew the rider hadn't moved on. She knew, in the way your body knows things before your mind has caught up, that she was being watched. She kept her hands moving. What she couldn't have known was that the man on the far bank was looking at her differently, than men usually looked at women working by rivers. Not the quick flicker of curiosity that passes and is forgotten. Something slower. The arrested attention of a person who has just recognized something they hadn't known they were looking for. His name was Julian Ashborne. He was 28 years old. He was the 5th Duke of Rochmire. The title came with 11,000 acres across 2 counties, a London townhouse in Mayfair, an annual income that most people in England couldn't have conceived of, and a weight of social obligation that would have broken a less composed man. He'd been educated at Eton and Oxford. He knew Latin and French and some Greek. He and Eleanor's father, had they ever met, would have had more in common than either of their respective positions implied. He was, to put it plainly, one of the most powerful men in England. He was also, at this particular moment, travelling under a different name, on a hired horse, in a coat that was good but not conspicuous, with no servants and no forwarding address and no intention of being found. This wasn't, in Regency England, difficult to arrange. A nobleman's identity was built from reputation and title, and the people who vouched for him in the right rooms. Away from his own county, he was simply a gentleman on personal business. Riding through unfamiliar landscape, stopping at country inns, he was Mr. Ashborne, nothing more. That was what the innkeeper last night had assumed. It was what the woman at the river would assume if she looked up. She didn't look up. He found that interesting. Most women, upon noticing a gentleman on horseback watching them, performed some version of awareness, a glance, a small posture adjustment, the quiet social negotiation of being seen while pretending not to be. The grammar of the era demanded it, and most people followed it without thinking. Eleanor's stillness was different. It wasn't the rigid kind, the stillness of someone pretending. It was the stillness of someone who genuinely hadn't rearranged herself at all. She was doing what she'd been doing before he arrived. His presence hadn't altered the calculation. He stayed on the horse for a long time, long enough that it became, by any reasonable standard, conspicuous. He didn't quite notice. Eleanor noticed. She noticed the way she noticed everything, without turning toward it, by making a careful, quiet note of it in the part of her mind where she kept things that required further thought. She finished the piece of linen she was working on. She shook it out and laid it across the flat rock beside her. Then she looked up. He was still there. He had the look of a man caught at something. Not embarrassed, exactly, but aware that he'd been watching longer than was quite correct. He was younger than she'd expected from the sound of the horse. He wore a plain coat and no obvious insignia. He had the bearing of someone accustomed to occupying space without explaining himself. She took all of this in over the course of about 2 seconds. Then she looked back at her work. That was the whole exchange. Julian rode on. He told himself for the next mile that he'd simply been appreciating the countryside. The river was pretty at this hour. A man who'd travelled from London might reasonably pause to take in a scene like that. He wasn't persuaded by his own argument. He rode back past the same stretch of river on his return. She was still there. This time she didn't look up at all. What fashionable society had done to Julian Ashborne was a particular kind of damage, not dramatic damage, not the kind you can point to and name. The quieter kind, which takes longer and leaves a person functional but subtly hollowed of something they should have had. The ton, the peerage and their families, the London season's unbroken circuit of balls and dinners and assembly and morning calls, was, depending on your position within it, one of the most relentlessly performative environments a human being could inhabit. Nothing in the ton was simply what it appeared to be. A dinner invitation was a political move, a dance was a negotiation, a conversation was an audition, and for a duke, This attention was constant and slightly airless. Julian had understood by the time he was 23 that he was never simply in a room. He was the most eligible man in the room. That fact preceded him everywhere. Women were charming around him in a particular way, the way that isn't really about the person at all, but about the title and the income and the life those things implied. Men were deferential in a particular way that was also not about him. He'd become reasonably good at telling the difference between genuine warmth and calculated performance. The consequence of that skill was a mild, persistent suspicion of warmth that arrived too easily. The woman at the river hadn't performed warmth. She'd barely performed awareness, and he found that, in a way he couldn't yet explain, the most genuinely interesting thing that had happened to him in months. He had come to this county because of a property dispute on a neighbouring estate that his steward had flagged. It also conveniently required him to be somewhere that was not London, not his own estate with its staff and its obligations, not Mayfair with its drawing rooms and its careful calculations, somewhere with fields and ordinary social rhythms, where he wasn't automatically the subject of every calculation in the room. He'd given his name at the inn as Mr. Ashborne, which was technically accurate. Ashborne was the family name, his by right, his before any title was involved. The Duke of Rochmire was a separate matter, a distinction that people outside his social world had no particular reason to reach for. He'd introduced himself by his own name and let the title sit quietly in the background where no one thought to look. By the moral logic of the era, this wasn't quite a lie. It was an omission. He hadn't thought through the consequences of it yet. He thought about the river instead. He thought about the way she'd looked up, brief, measuring, without visible calculation, and then looked back down, as if he were the ordinary thing in that picture and she were the one who belonged there. He hadn't been regarded as ordinary in a very long time. The sun was fully up now. The river below the road was gold and moving. Somewhere on that bank a woman was still working unhurried, entirely herself, and Julian Ashborne, 5th Duke of Rochmire, master of 11,000 acres, holder of a title that opened every door in England, found himself thinking that he might take another early ride tomorrow morning, just to see the countryside. It was remarkable country, really. He did go back, not just the next morning, the morning after that as well, and the one after that. He told himself a different story each time. The road was convenient, the air was good, the light at this hour had a particular quality that didn't exist later in the day. All of it was true. None of it was the point. The point was that on the 4th morning, he tied the horse to a tree on his side of the bank, walked down to the water's edge, and said, "Good morning." Eleanor looked up. She'd been expecting this, in the way you expect things you've been quietly preparing for without admitting to yourself that you're preparing. He was going to speak eventually. She'd known that from the second morning when he'd come back. Men who were simply appreciating the countryside did not come back. She said good morning in return. The exchange that followed was, by the elaborate social standards of Regency England, deeply irregular. She was a servant. He was presenting as a gentleman. The correct behaviour, in the event of unavoidable proximity, was for her to be deferential and brief, and for him to be pleasant but distant. The distance was the important part. It maintained the social architecture. It kept everyone in their assigned place in the picture. Eleanor was not deferential. She wasn't rude. She simply answered his questions as if they were reasonable questions asked by a reasonable person, which they were. He asked about the river, whether it flooded in winter, which direction the current ran. She told him. He asked how long she'd lived in the county. She said most of her life. He asked what the market town was like. She said it was ordinary, and that ordinary things had their uses, and something about the way she said it made him want to know what she meant by that specifically. He asked what she meant by that specifically. She told him. It was 10 minutes, perhaps 15. She had work to do, and she did it while they talked, which he found, instead of rude, oddly comfortable. Being spoken to by someone whose hands were busy with something else, who wasn't performing attention, who was simply present in the way that people are present when they aren't trying to impress you. He rode away thinking about what she'd said about ordinary things having their uses. It was, he reflected, the first opinion anyone had offered him in a very long time that wasn't implicitly designed to make him think well of the person offering it. He went back the next day, and the day after. The question of why Julian Ashborne kept returning to that particular river at that particular hour is, on the surface, not a complicated one. But the surface answer misses the layer underneath. The layer underneath was this. He was tired. Not physically tired. He slept well and rode well and ate well, in the way that men who've always had adequate resources tend to manage. He was tired in the way that a life of being watched produces in certain people. The specific weariness of never quite being seen, of being the title before being the man, of knowing that the warmth directed at you in a drawing room has almost nothing to do with you personally and almost everything to do with what you represent. This wasn't self-pity. Julian was too clear-sighted for self-pity, and too aware that his complaints were the complaints of a man with 11,000 acres and a Mayfair townhouse, which doesn't tend to generate much sympathy. He knew perfectly well that his problem was a good problem to have. That didn't make the tiredness any less real. What Lady Caroline Lamb's story illustrates, and she was the cautionary tale that every member of the ton carried quietly in those years, is how completely Regency society consumed the people inside it. Lady Caroline Lamb was a real woman with a real interior life. She was also, from approximately 1812 onward, a story the ton told about itself. When she pursued her love for Lord Byron with a degree of honesty that fashionable society found inconvenient, the ton turned her into a warning. Not because she'd done something illegal, not because she had harmed anyone, because she'd been honest at the wrong pitch and in the wrong rooms, and Regency society rewarded that kind of honesty the way it rewarded most uncomfortable things, by quietly dismantling the person who'd produced it. Her husband, William Lamb, refused to formally divorce her, a form of protection in his way, but they had effectively separated by 1825, 3 years before she died. He was by most accounts a patient man, but patience has its limits in a world that applies constant pressure, and social standing, once chipped at consistently enough, doesn't hold its shape. By the time Caroline Lamb died in 1828, she'd been largely excluded from the world that had once celebrated her. Julian had watched the arc from close enough to see the details. What it taught him was not that honesty was dangerous exactly. It was that the specific kind of honesty the ton punished was authentic feeling that didn't perform itself correctly, feeling that didn't follow the approved grammar of social expression. A duke could be warm, he could be charming, he could be the subject of 100 approving remarks across a season. What he couldn't be, without consequence, was genuinely moved by something, genuinely uncertain, genuinely affected by a person or a moment in a way that showed. So he'd learned, gradually and mostly without noticing, to keep the real reactions slightly back, behind the ones that were appropriate. Not deception, exactly. A kind of translation. The river was the only place in several years where he hadn't translated anything. Eleanor, for her part, was working through her own calculation. She was not naive. 10 years of her aunt's household had guaranteed that. She knew that a gentleman who returned to the same stretch of river 6 mornings in a row was not simply admiring the landscape. She knew that conversations between men of his apparent position and women of her actual position were not, in the social mathematics of the era, uncomplicated. She also knew, and this was the part she returned to most often in her pre-dawn accounting, that she hadn't misread him. He was not performing interest. He was not charming her in the way men sometimes charmed women they intended to take advantage of. He was simply there, curious and direct and slightly less careful than a man of his standing usually allowed himself to be. That carefulness she could feel him relaxing, increment by increment, over the course of those early mornings, was the thing she trusted least and found most compelling at the same time. She also noticed that he never asked where she lived, or who she worked for, or how she came to be here at this hour. He asked about the river, about the county, about her opinions, which nobody else had requested in approximately a decade. He did not ask about her situation, which would have required her to explain it, which would have required her to feel its full dimensions in front of a stranger. She was grateful for that omission. She called him Mr. Ashborne, because that was the name he'd given. He never corrected it. She knew it wasn't the whole truth, the way you know a room has a locked door, not because you can see the lock, but because the door is never opened. She filed this away as one of the things that required further thought, and continued talking to him about the river and the county and whatever else he asked. It was, she thought, one of the more peculiar friendships she could have imagined. It was also the most honest conversation she'd had in years. By the 3rd week, Julian had begun to understand that Eleanor Hale was not simply dignified in the way observers of working women sometimes describe dignity. She was opinionated, specifically, precisely, dryly opinionated, in the way of someone who has had years of enforced silence and has therefore spent those years having very complete thoughts with nowhere to put them. When she offered an opinion, carefully, as though testing the structural integrity of the air between them before committing full weight, it had the quality of something that had been entirely thought through before being said. He found this, without quite meaning to, irresistible. She said, on a Tuesday morning in November when the river had gone grey with the first cold of autumn, that she thought most people were braver in theory than in practice. He asked what she meant. She said that most people, when given the opportunity to do the right thing, found a reason why this particular situation was the exception. He said that was a bleak view. She said she didn't find it bleak. She found it honest, and that honesty about human nature was more useful than flattery of it. He sat with that for a moment. Then he said she was probably right. She looked at him sideways in the particular way she had, a quick glance that managed to convey both genuine attention and complete composure, and went back to the linen she was rinsing. Julian rode home thinking that he hadn't told her the truth about who he was, and that by her own formulation this made him one of the people who'd found a reason why this particular situation was the exception. He didn't enjoy that conclusion. He went back the next morning anyway. What made the friendship? Because by this point it clearly was that, whatever else it was or might become, unusual beyond the obvious social irregularity was this. Neither of them was performing. Julian had spent a decade in rooms full of people performing. He knew what it looked like. Eleanor's face was simply present. When she disagreed with something he said, which she did regularly, which nobody else in his life currently did, she said so without constructing it into something more palatable. When she found something amusing, she smiled briefly, in a way that arrived before she'd decided to let it. There was no managed distance between her interior experience and her exterior expression, and this, in a world that ran entirely on that managed distance, was startling. For Eleanor, the friendship offered something she hadn't had words for. The experience of being taken seriously, not kindly, seriously. He engaged with what she said as if it had weight. He pushed back when he disagreed, which was the more important thing, because people who are being kind don't push back, and people who are paying genuine attention do. She was careful, though. She was 17, and she understood, with the clarity of someone who'd been surviving on clarity for a long time, that there was a large and unbridged gap between a gentleman who found a servant girl's conversation interesting and any future that could reasonably be built from that. She had determined years ago that imagining futures she couldn't reach was a form of self-cruelty she couldn't afford. So she was present at the river. She talked to him, and she was careful to feel only what was already happening. She wasn't entirely successful. Julian noticed around the 4th week that she never mentioned her family. She mentioned the house she lived in, obliquely, with the careful neutrality of someone describing a place they inhabit but do not belong to. She mentioned the county. She mentioned the tasks of the household in a matter-of-fact way that made clear she did all of them. What she didn't mention was any warmth inside that house, any person in it who mattered to her, any sense of being home anywhere at all. He didn't press it, but he thought about it on the rides back. He thought about the particular quality of her composure, how it didn't feel like contentment. It felt more like a form of self-sufficiency that had been built out of necessity rather than chosen. He knew what that looked like. He'd been told more than once that he had a similar quality himself. He also noticed that she was considerably more educated than her situation implied. She used precise language, not affected language, not the kind that performs literacy, but the kind that suggests someone who has read widely and thought about what they read. She used words correctly that most people in her apparent position wouldn't encounter. She had, clearly, a mind that had been working steadily on whatever materials it could find for years, with no one to notice and no one to encourage it. He thought about that at some length. He thought about what it would take to maintain that, the reading, the thinking, the careful interior architecture, in a life that had given her no room for it. Not no time, exactly. The pre-dawn hours at the river suggested she'd found some, but no recognition, no audience, no one to confirm that the mind at work was worth anything at all. He found that, for reasons he didn't immediately examine, quietly moving. The first time he made her laugh, genuinely laugh, not the small, polite acknowledgement of something pleasant. He'd said something slightly self-deprecating about a horse he'd once owned that had been extremely expensive and entirely useless, and she looked up from the river and laughed before she'd caught herself. It was brief, it was not particularly loud, it was entirely unperformed. It was the best sound he'd heard in a long time. That was, roughly, the moment Julian Ashborne understood he was in a considerable amount of trouble. Not the dramatic kind of trouble, the quiet kind. The kind where you ride home thinking about a sound someone made, and the next morning you're at the river before she is, waiting, without having precisely decided to wait, sitting on the bank with the reins loose in your hands and the mist on the water and the birds just starting, and you realise that the question of whether to come back no longer feels like a question. Eleanor, that same morning, arrived at the river and found him already there. She looked at him for a moment. Then she set her basket down and began to work. They talked about the cold, and the way the river ran differently in November than in summer, and what she thought the winter would be like that year. At no point did either of them acknowledge that he had been waiting. At no point did either of them say anything about what this was, or what it was becoming, or what either of them intended to do about it. Some conversations are primarily the things that aren't said in them. The weeks that followed had their own quiet rhythm. Julian would arrive at the river before dawn. Eleanor would arrive shortly after, or sometimes she was there first, the lantern she'd carried from the house set on the bank while she sorted linen, and he would come down the slope from where he'd tied the horse, and they would fall into conversation with the ease of people who have, without planning to, become the best part of each other's mornings. They talked about everything except what mattered most. They talked about the history of the county. Eleanor knew it well, in the way that people who've been confined to a place and left to think about it tend to know it better than people who've merely passed through. They talked about books. Julian had read considerably more than she had, by volume, but she'd read certain things more carefully, which produced the more interesting opinions. They talked about the nature of obligation, which Julian introduced obliquely as a philosophical subject, and which Eleanor engaged with directly as a practical one. She said she thought obligation was only as meaningful as the relationship it came from. He said he thought that was probably right, and that it made certain obligations he was under feel considerably less meaningful than they were supposed to. She heard what he meant by that, even if he hadn't said it plainly. She said that most burdens felt lighter when they were chosen rather than inherited. He said that was easy enough to say when choice was available. She said, with the particular evenness of someone speaking from experience, that she didn't entirely disagree with him. He thought about that for a day. She was not telling him that she understood his specific situation. She didn't know his specific situation. She was doing something more useful, which was telling him about the nature of situations like it, and about what helped and what didn't, from the position of someone who had navigated one from much farther down. He began, around this time, to feel seriously uncomfortable about the omission. The problem was not that he'd lied. Technically, he hadn't lied. But the distinction between a lie and a deliberate omission becomes considerably less meaningful as the relationship it's embedded in becomes more meaningful. He had introduced himself as Mr. Ashborne. She had taken him, reasonably and entirely correctly, as a gentleman of some means who was passing through the county on business. She had engaged with him as that person. What he was asking of her, without her knowledge or consent, was that she trust Mr. Ashborne, who was mostly real, without knowing that attached to Mr. Ashborne was a title and an estate and a social position that would change every calculation she'd made about this friendship. He knew this. He kept going to the river anyway, which is the thing he would later be least proud of and most honest about when he was older, and more inclined toward honesty about his younger self. Eleanor's aunt noticed the morning absences. She had always noticed them, in a general way. Eleanor was at the river on laundry days, which was accounted for, unremarkable, expected. What she began to notice in the way that people notice things they haven't been actively watching for was that Eleanor was coming back from those mornings different. Not visibly, not dramatically. There was nothing to point to. But her aunt was a woman who had spent a considerable number of years being watchfully attentive to the people around her, which is a quality that can come from genuine care or from something considerably less generous, and in her case it came from the latter. She watched people the way you watch a fire, not because you love fire, but because you know what it can do if you stop paying attention. Eleanor came back from the river on mornings in November with the particular quality of a person who has recently been taken seriously. It's a difficult thing to describe but easy to recognize if you've been watching, a slight lifting of something that's usually held, a steadiness that's rested rather than maintained. Her aunt recognized it immediately, the way you recognize something you once had yourself. She started asking questions. Where had Eleanor been this morning? Did she need to be reminded that the washing was supposed to be done in the household laundry, not made into an excuse for wandering? Was there something she had to say about how she was spending her time? Eleanor answered each question with the precise minimum of information required, which she had also been doing for 10 years, and which drove her aunt considerably further into frustration because it gave her nothing to hold on to. What the aunt had deduced, or suspected, or was on the verge of understanding, was enough to make her dangerous. A man, a gentleman apparently, coming to the river on mornings that coincided with Eleanor's laundry schedule. She didn't know who he was yet, but she began making inquiries, the kind of inquiries that Regency Society ran extremely well, the quiet word at the inn, the question placed sideways at the market, the slightly too casual conversation with the vicar who knew everyone's business because everyone told it to him in the assumption of confidence. Small questions, not about Julian specifically, about any gentleman who might be staying in the area, any notable newcomer, any business that might have brought someone of means to this particular county in this particular season. The answers, when they came, were not what she'd expected. Meanwhile, Julian had made a decision. He was going to tell Eleanor the truth, not because he'd resolved the question of what it meant for their friendship if she knew. He hadn't resolved that. He'd been turning it over for 2 weeks and it didn't resolve, but there was a line he'd drawn somewhere inside himself, probably around the Tuesday she'd told him about people finding reasons why their particular situation was the exception, and he'd been on the wrong side of it ever since. He would tell her, he decided, on Friday morning when the weather was supposed to be dry and the river would be clear. He arrived at the river on Friday morning. Eleanor was already there. So was someone else. A man was coming down the lane behind him, on a very good horse, in a very good coat, and with the look of someone who has known Julian Ashborne for 15 years, and is both pleased and surprised to encounter him here rather than in London. Julian heard his name before he could stop it, not Mr. Ashborne, the other one. Your Grace. Good God, what are you doing in this county? They said at the inn you were dealing with the Pemberton business, but I never imagined. He stopped, because Julian had gone very still and the woman kneeling at the bank of the river had also gone very still, and the name that had just been said, Your Grace. 2 words, the specific social formula that placed a person in the hierarchy of the entire country above almost everyone else in it, was sitting in the morning air between all 3 of them with no way to unsay it. Eleanor did not look up immediately. When she did, it was not at Julian's face. She looked at the river, at the water, at her own hands resting on the linen which had gone still. Then she set the linen down very carefully on the rock beside her. She stood up. She turned and looked at Julian directly, in the way she did everything, without hurry, without performance, with the complete steadiness that had distinguished her from the first morning he had ever seen her. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Julian sent the other man away with 3 words and a look that indicated the full force of what those 2 words, Your Grace, actually meant. The man went. They were alone. Julian said her name. Just that. Eleanor said with the particular evenness of someone who has decided not to display anything she'd prefer to keep, that she thought she should finish the laundry before the water got too cold. He said, Eleanor. She said. She knew the laundry wasn't going to finish itself. He said, "Please." She stopped. She had her back to him. The river moved. The birds were well into their morning now, the full chorus of it, the kind of sound that goes on entirely without regard for what the people beside it are going through. She said, without turning around, "How long?" He said, "Since the beginning. The name is my own. The title is what I left out." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because I was tired of being it before being anything else." He said, "Because I wanted to know what it was like to have a conversation that wasn't about what I could offer." He said, "Because the first morning I saw you, you didn't look up, and I thought, and this was honest, this was the first thing in months that was entirely honest, that you were the most self-possessed person I had ever seen." She turned around. Her face was the same face it always was. The same steadiness, the same composure, the same complete inhabiting of whatever she was feeling without the feeling overrunning the edges. What was underneath it he couldn't see. What was on the surface was someone deciding something. She said, "I need to go." And she went. The thing about a revelation of that kind is that it doesn't land all at once. It lands in layers, each one heavier than the last over the hours and days that follow. Eleanor walked back to her aunt's house carrying the laundry basket and a silence that must have been visible on her face, because her aunt, who noticed everything, looked at her once and said nothing. Which was unusual. Her aunt generally found occasion to say something. What Eleanor thought about sitting in the kitchen later was not the title. The title was almost the least of it. She'd known or half known that something was being withheld. She'd said as much to herself in so many words and filed it away. What she hadn't anticipated was how reasonable the explanation would be. She'd expected the something to be a wife, a history he couldn't name, a debt, or a disgrace, or something in the past that he was running from. All of those would have made a certain kind of sense. She hadn't expected. I was tired of being my title before being myself. She understood that. She understood it completely and precisely, in the way that you understand things that are said in language you didn't know someone else spoke. The experience of being known by a category rather than by your actual self, of having other people's ideas about what you arrive in the room before you do, was not, as it turned out, a problem exclusive to dukes. She had spent 10 years being the orphan, the dependent, the servant, the girl with no prospects and no origins, and the exhaustion of being reduced to that day after day was something she could have told him about in considerable detail. She was angry. Not at the omission specifically, though she was also that. She was angry at the particular unfairness of finding that she understood him, just as understanding became the most complicated possible response. It would have been considerably more convenient to have been simply deceived. Julian, for his part, spent the day doing nothing useful. He went back to the inn and sat in the parlour and thought about the way she'd said "I need to go," and the specific quality of composure with which she'd said it. He thought about all the conversations they'd had, which was the more useful exercise, and tried to locate the moment at which his position had shifted from someone who was enjoying an unexpected friendship to someone who was significantly invested in its continuation. He could not locate a single moment. It had been a gradual accumulation, the way water raises a river, not by any one addition, but by the steady sum of all of them. He sent her a letter. This was, by Regency standards, both appropriate and insufficient. An unmarried woman receiving a letter from a man was always a social event, even a small one. A woman in Eleanor's position receiving a letter from a duke was considerably more complex. But he had very few other options, and he was not yet prepared to do nothing. The letter was 3 paragraphs. It contained no declarations and made no requests. It said he was sorry that the method of disclosure had not been his choice. It said everything he had told her was true, including the parts about the horse. It said he would be at the river tomorrow at dawn if she wanted to speak, and that if she did not appear he would understand, and that he would not presume to return after that unless she asked him to. Eleanor received the letter. She read it 3 times. She went to the river. She didn't go for him, she told herself. With specific honesty she applied to her own motivations. She went because she had things to say, and she had learned, over the past several weeks, that he was capable of hearing them. She went because the alternative was carrying it alone, which was what she'd always done, and which had, on balance, been necessary but not particularly good for her. She got to the river before him. She was working by the time he arrived. He stopped at the bank's edge. He didn't say good morning because that seemed like the wrong register entirely. He said her name, just her name. She looked up and said, "Sit down then." He sat down. She said without stopping the work, she'd been thinking about what he'd said about being tired of being his title before being himself. She said she thought she understood that better than he might expect. She said that did not mean she wasn't angry about the deception, because she was, and she thought he knew why. He said he did. She said she needed to know whether anything he'd told her was calculated to get something from her. Not money. She wasn't thinking about money. She meant something else. He said, "No." He said, the conversations were real, including the ones where she'd been right and he'd been wrong, which was most of them. Something shifted in her face. Not a large shift. The kind you notice only if you've been watching someone's face for several weeks and have become, without entirely meaning to, very attentive to its gradations. She said, "All right." She went back to the laundry. He stayed on the bank. They talked about the river. What happened next did not happen quickly. That's worth noting because there's a temptation to make it feel inevitable, to say that of course the aunt acted, of course the scandal came, of course the machinery of Regency disapproval was always going to find a way to reach them. But real things rarely happen with that kind of narrative efficiency. What actually happened was slower and more human and more particular than a pattern. Eleanor's aunt received information in pieces. The first piece was from the innkeeper's wife, who mentioned quite casually that the gentleman staying at the Three Bells for the past several weeks had finally revealed himself to a passing acquaintance. A duke, apparently. One of the more significant ones. The Duke of Rochmire. The second piece was Eleanor's face, on the morning she came back from the river after the exposure. The aunt was a person of average moral imagination but considerable social calculation. She understood, within a few minutes of putting those 2 pieces together, what had been happening at the river on laundry mornings. She also understood, with the cold clarity of someone who'd been planning defences against Eleanor's improvement for 10 years, that a duke's interest in Eleanor was a serious threat to the arrangement she had made. If Eleanor were elevated, if she were married, if she were acknowledged, if she were legitimized in the social sense, Eleanor's position in the aunt's household was finished. The aunt had constructed a version of her household that depended on Eleanor being slightly outside the category of person who warranted consideration. That version would not survive a duke, so she acted. She did not confront Eleanor directly. That would have been the wrong move, and she was not a person who made wrong moves out of temper. She acted in the medium that Regency society ran on most efficiently, whisper. She wrote a letter to the wife of a local magistrate, a woman with considerable social reach and an enthusiasm for information that made her the ideal recipient. The letter was careful. It expressed concern. Concern, that most socially acceptable of weapons. It noted, with the specific vagueness that leaves nothing to disprove, that Eleanor's parentage had never been entirely established, that the circumstances of her birth were unfortunately obscure, that for a gentleman of notable standing to be associating with someone of such murky provenance was, perhaps, something a friend might feel obliged to mention. The letter did not make a single claim that could be directly refuted. That was the point. In Regency England this was sufficient. A woman's reputation did not require evidence against it. It required only the suggestion that evidence might exist. The magistrate's wife mentioned it at dinner to 3 people. By the end of the week, the suggestion had travelled to 7 households. By the end of the following week, Eleanor Hale, who had done nothing except talk to a man at a river, had an uncertain origin, an obscure birth, and a character that polite society was beginning, with every appearance of sympathy, to question. This is what people mean when they say Regency scandal was a weapon. Not a dramatic weapon, a quiet one that could be deployed by a woman sitting at a writing desk in a respectable house, with no evidence and no raised voice, and could travel outward from there faster than any correction could follow it. Julian heard about it on a Thursday morning from his steward, who'd heard it from the innkeeper, who'd heard it from the butcher, who had heard it from the magistrate's wife's housekeeper. The specific route was irrelevant. The content was not. He sat with it for approximately 10 minutes. Then he sent for his solicitor. He also sent for the vicar of the local parish church. The vicar arrived that afternoon looking somewhat uncertain about what a duke might want from him on a Thursday. Julian explained what he wanted, which was access to the parish register, not the current one, the one from 17 years ago. The vicar found this an unusual request, and Julian explained, with the particular economy of someone accustomed to being obeyed, that the word unusual was not relevant to what he was asking. The register was produced. Parish baptism registers in Regency England were meticulous documents. The Church of England had been maintaining them since 1538, nearly 300 years by this point, and the entries were standardized. Date of baptism, given name, parents' names, father's occupation, date of parents' marriage, every entry in ink, every entry witnessed, every entry permanent. The entry Julian was looking for was there. Eleanor Mary Hale, baptized in April. Father, Thomas Hale, solicitor of this parish. Mother, Margaret Hale, née Whitmore of Shropshire. Parents married in the prior year, in St. Peter's Church, Whitchurch, Shropshire. The record was clean and complete and entirely unambiguous. Eleanor Hale was the legitimate daughter of a married couple, both now deceased, both documented. She was not of uncertain origin. She was not of obscure provenance. She was the daughter of a solicitor, legitimately born, her birth recorded in 2 churches in 2 counties, neither of which had been consulted before the whisper campaign had begun. Julian had his solicitor copy the relevant entries from both registers and draw up a statement of verification. Then he did something that was, by the social standards of Regency England, both unconventional and entirely within his power. He wrote to the magistrate, not the wife, the magistrate himself. The letter was polite and brief and left no ambiguity. It noted that certain claims had been made regarding the birth and provenance of Miss Eleanor Hale, daughter of Thomas Hale, solicitor. It noted that these claims were not supported by the documentary record. It enclosed verified copies of both parish registers and the solicitor's verification. It noted that the Duke of Rochmire considered the matter conclusively resolved, and that he would appreciate the magistrate's assistance in ensuring the resolution circulated as widely as the original suggestion had. The magistrate passed the information to his wife the same evening. Within 10 days, the whisper that had travelled outward in one direction was travelling back in another. The uncertainty about Eleanor's origins was replaced by documented certainty. The aunt's letter, by this point identifiable to anyone paying attention as the source of the original claim, was now a liability. The magistrate's wife mentioned at dinner that she'd always thought the claim seemed improbable. The aunt said nothing publicly. She sent for Eleanor. Eleanor came into the aunt's sitting room and stood with her hands in front of her in the way she had learned to stand in that room, composed, upright, waiting. The aunt told her she was a fool if she thought a duke would marry a solicitor's orphan. Eleanor said, quite calmly, that she supposed they'd find out. The aunt said society would not accept it. Eleanor said she had never made a spectacle of anything in her life. The aunt said that Eleanor's father would have been ashamed. This was the weapon she'd saved for last, the most personal, the one designed to reach the part of Eleanor that no other argument could touch. Eleanor stood with it for a moment. Then she said quietly, without raising her voice, she thought her father would have been glad that someone had finally read the register. She left the room. Julian came to the house the next morning. Not to the river, to the house, in his own carriage with his own coat that was not plain and not chosen for anonymity, with his name spoken directly to the servant who opened the door. He asked to speak with Miss Hale. The servant went upstairs. The aunt appeared at the top of the stairs and Julian looked up at her, once, with the expression of someone who has recently communicated in writing with the local magistrate and is entirely prepared to communicate in other ways if required. The aunt went back into her room. Eleanor came downstairs. She was wearing her ordinary dress. She hadn't known he was coming. She had flour on one hand from the morning's work in the kitchen. She stopped on the second-to-last stair, which put them at the same height for perhaps the first time, and looked at him with a particular steadiness that had distinguished her from the first morning he'd ever seen her. He said, "I know what she did." Eleanor said, "I know what you did about it." He said, "The register is in your name, and your father's name, and your mother's name, and it has been for 17 years. You were always exactly who you are. The rest of it was just a silence someone chose to keep." She said, "Yes." He said, "I should like to not keep any more silences where you're concerned, and I recognize that asking you something now is asking it under circumstances that make it difficult to answer freely, and if you need time I would rather give you that than do this wrong." She said, "What are you asking?" He said, "I'm asking if you would consider being my wife. I'm asking it because I know you'll tell me the truth about whether you want to, which is something I'm not accustomed to, and which I find that I cannot do without. I am asking it because the river in the morning is the only place I have felt entirely myself in several years, and that is not about the river." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She said, "The flower on my hand." He said, "I don't mind the flower." She said, "I want to be certain of something first." She said, "Do you understand what you're taking on? Not the social difficulty. I know you can manage that. I mean me. I am not uncomplicated. I have opinions about most things and I'm unlikely to stop having them. I have 10 years of enforced silence that has made me possibly more direct than is comfortable. I am not going to pretend to be someone I'm not because a title makes it expected." He said, "I know." He said, "That's why I'm asking." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Yes." The engagement was announced in the usual way: a notice, a letter to the relevant families, a confirmation through the proper social channels. What was not usual was anything else about it. The ton had opinions. The ton always had opinions, and a duke marrying a solicitor's daughter, orphaned, unknown, recently the subject of a whispered scandal that had been publicly and officially disproved, was the kind of situation that the ton could discuss for an entire season without quite running out of angles. There were those who said Julian had lost his senses. There were those who said it was romantic in a way that they found alternately admirable and suspicious. There were those who made the social calculation quickly and determined that a woman the Duke of Rochmire had publicly defended, legally verified, and chosen was a woman whose acquaintance was now worth cultivating. Eleanor, learning of these various positions, said she found the third group the most honest, which made Julian laugh for the first time in a very long time about something the ton had done. The engagement period lasted 3 months. 3 months was not a long time by Regency standards for a courtship, but then the courtship had already been happening, without the formal framework around it, for rather longer than 3 months. What the formal period provided was something different: the socially sanctioned space in which Eleanor could be introduced to Julian's world not as a stranger, not as an anomaly, but as the person who was shortly going to inhabit it alongside him. This was not easy. It was not easy in the practical sense. There were introductions to be made, and some of them were awkward, and some of the women Julian had known in London looked at Eleanor with an assessment in their eyes that she recognised, because people had been assessing her all her life. She had learned, over 10 years of being assessed and found to come up short, how to stand in a room and let the assessment happen without letting it land. She stood that way in those rooms now, and Julian stood beside her, and the assessments happened, and then people found that she was more interesting to talk to than they'd anticipated, and the assessments quietly changed. It was not easy in the personal sense either, because Eleanor had spent 17 years not allowing herself to want things she couldn't have, and the abrupt collapse of that discipline left her in the somewhat uncomfortable position of having to learn how to want things without flinching from the wanting. She was, by any honest account, not immediately comfortable being a person things were done for, rather than a person doing things for everyone else. Julian noticed. He was, by this point, considerably practiced at noticing her. He didn't tell her to relax about it, because people who are told to relax about things do not relax about things. He simply waited and stayed, and continued to be the person who talked to her about the river and the county and whether she'd been right about the winter, and after a while the discomfort became something smaller, and she stopped noticing it quite so often. The wedding was held in the parish church, not the grand metropolitan church that Julian's position might have suggested. The local parish church, in the county where she'd spent 10 years at a river before dawn, 3 minutes' walk from the market town where the register sat with her parents' names in it. This was Julian's suggestion. Eleanor, when he made it, looked at him for a moment and said nothing, and he understood that looking at him was the answer. In Regency England, what a woman gained through marriage to a man of Julian's rank was, legally and socially, the entirety of her new position. She gained his title. She became the Duchess of Rochmire, and with it, the standing in every room that the title commanded. She gained his estates. She gained the legal and social recognition of every right that has been withheld from her for 10 years. She was no longer the solicitor's orphan in someone else's household. She was, in the precise language of the law and the equally precise language of Regency society, exactly the person the register had always described her as being, She had simply, finally, been seen. What the law and the title couldn't give her, but what she already had and had always had, was everything else. The opinions, the steadiness, the particular quality that Hannah More had written about, the thing she could only call interior dignity, the quality of a person who knows what she is even when the world around her has decided not to notice. Eleanor hadn't found that in Julian's drawing rooms. She'd brought it with her. She'd had it at the river, and she'd had it in her aunt's kitchen, and she'd had it on the morning she was 7 years old, and the world rearranged itself around her without consulting her. That quality Julian had understood by the Tuesday she'd told him about people finding reasons why their situation was the exception, was not something a title produced. It was something a person was. And it was, in the end, the one thing about her that had nothing to do with what had happened to her, and everything to do with who she was underneath all of it. There is something worth sitting with here, before this story settles into its final image. The register had always been there. It had been there for 17 years, on a shelf in a church in a market town, its ink patient and unchanged. Eleanor's father had made sure when he married and when his daughter was born that the record existed. He'd been a solicitor, a man who understood that paper was protection, that official record was the one thing that outlasted everything else. He couldn't have known he would die when Eleanor was 7. He couldn't have known his sister would take his daughter in and keep her in silence. But he'd made the record, and the record stayed. And when someone finally came looking, it was still there. The 10 years between the record sitting in the register and Eleanor walking into the parish church to be married were not years the record spent waiting for her exactly. Records don't wait, they simply exist. But there is something in the image that stays, the ledger on the shelf, the ink intact, the legal fact of who she was preserved through all of it. Through the aunt's silence and the aunt's whisper, and the years at the river and the mornings in the cold, all of it survived, accurate and unchanged, until someone who had the means and the reason came to read it. Her father's daughter. All along, what Eleanor's new position meant in the specific practical terms of Regency domestic life was considerable. She became the mistress of Rochmire Hall, a house with 47 rooms, a staff of 22, and a history that predated everyone currently living in it by several centuries. The house had its own river, a different river, wider and more formal, managed rather than wild. She went to it on the first morning after they arrived. Julian found her there an hour later, sitting on the bank, not working, just sitting, which was something she'd never had the occasion to do at the other river, and which apparently required some practice. He sat beside her. She said it was a very organised river. He said yes, rivers on estates tended to be. She said she wasn't sure that was an improvement. He said he wasn't sure either. They sat for a while without speaking, which is a thing you can only do comfortably with a person you know very well, and which is, when you can manage it, one of the better available indicators that you're in the right place. The staff at Rochmere Hall received Eleanor with the particular careful neutrality that trained domestic servants apply to situations they have not yet fully assessed. They had all heard the story, in the way that household staff always heard everything, faster and more accurately than their employers would have preferred. They knew she had been a servant. They knew she had worked in a kitchen. Several of them had, with some discretion, made preliminary determinations about how they were going to feel about that. What they found over the first several weeks was that Eleanor was extremely good at running a house. Not in the theoretical way of a woman who'd been instructed in household management as a social accomplishment. In the actual way, the way that comes from having done the work yourself and understanding not just what is required, but what it costs the person doing it. She knew how long laundry actually took. She knew what happened when the kitchen copper was let to cool too long. She knew the physical reality of the tasks her staff performed in a way that most mistresses of large houses did not, and had no particular incentive to. This produced an odd effect. The staff, who'd been prepared to be patient and politely distant, found instead that they were working for someone who thanked them specifically for specific things, and who asked about their circumstances with genuine curiosity, and who, on one occasion that became a household story, apologized to the laundrymaid for a mistake in the scheduling that had resulted in an unnecessary doubling of work on a cold day. Apologized. Not vaguely, and not to the housekeeper on the maid's behalf. Directly. The housekeeper told Julian about it later, not as a complaint, as the kind of story people tell when they've revised an opinion and want to record the moment of revision. Julian said he wasn't surprised. The housekeeper said she suspected he wasn't. Eleanor also wrote to Hannah More. This was not a simple thing to arrange. More was elderly by this point, and her health was variable, and a letter from a new duchess who wished to discuss the nature of dignity in working women was not, perhaps, the correspondence she'd expected to receive in her last years. But she answered. In 3 paragraphs, in handwriting that was still precise even if it was slower than it had been, she wrote back to Eleanor and said that she was glad someone had found a way to demonstrate that the quality she'd spent 50 years writing about was real and had consequences and could not be permanently suppressed. Eleanor kept the letter. She kept it in the same small leather case where she kept the verified copy of the parish register, her birth record, her parents' names, the date of their marriage, all of it in the patient ink that had been waiting for her on that shelf for 17 years. The letter from Hannah More sat on top of the register. She opened the case occasionally, not often. When she opened it, she didn't read anything in it. She just looked at the documents and then closed it again, and what passed across her face when she did this was not something she explained to anyone. She didn't need to explain it. Julian knew what it was. He'd had something similar himself once. The particular feeling of something that had cost you a great deal, finally being in the right place. The feeling that didn't quite have a name, because it wasn't happiness exactly, and it wasn't relief exactly, and it wasn't the dramatic thing you'd imagined it would be. It was quieter than all of those, a settling. The specific sensation of something that had been slightly wrong for a long time becoming right, not with any announcement, just becoming. That was what Eleanor was, what he was, in the particular economy of 2 people who had found each other across a river, and a social gap and a significant omission on his part, was the person she said what she actually thought to, which was, by his own measurement, the more valuable thing he was able to offer her, more valuable than the title or the estates or the 47 rooms or the organised river. The quality of his attention, the fact that he listened as if her answers mattered, because they did, and because he'd understood from the first Tuesday at the river that an opinion arrived at through genuine thought was worth more than any number of comfortable agreements. She told him, in the 2nd month of their marriage, that she thought he was more afraid of being wrong than he admitted. He said that was probably accurate. She said she found it reassuring. She said most people were afraid of being wrong in a way that made them defensive about it. He was afraid of it in a way that made him careful. There was a difference. He thought about that for a day. Then he said, "Yes, there is." She said, "I know." The London season arrived in the spring, and Julian took Eleanor to London. This was, of course, the real test. Not the county neighbours, who had processed the story and arrived at their various positions on it over the preceding months. London was where the ton lived in concentrated form, where the drawing rooms were larger and the opinions were faster, and the assessment of a new duchess would be conducted with the full thoroughness that fashionable society applied to anything it found interesting. And Eleanor Hale, now Eleanor Ashborne, Duchess of Rochmere, was, to the London ton, extremely interesting. The townhouse in Mayfair had been prepared, the staff there had been informed, the social calendar had been arranged, with some care, to introduce Eleanor gradually rather than all at once. A dinner here, a morning call there, a carefully selected assembly before anything grander. Julian was thorough about preparation, and Eleanor had learned over the preceding months that his thoroughness was one of the ways he showed care. He didn't announce it, he just arranged things well. She arrived in London in March, with the particular quality she'd brought to every room she'd ever walked into. Present, composed, noticeably herself. The first dinner was at the home of one of Julian's oldest friends, a man who'd known him since Eton, whose wife was warm and unstuffy, and who had, according to Julian, met the story of Eleanor with something close to satisfaction, because she had long thought Julian was too much in his own head to find someone he could actually talk to. Eleanor, upon being told this, said she thought she liked Julian's friend's wife already. She was right. At the dinner, Eleanor was seated between the friend's wife and a retired general who was considerably more interested in the conversation than in the social arithmetic of who Eleanor had been before she was who she was. They talked about agricultural management, which he'd spent 3 decades ignoring on his estate, and which Eleanor, having run a domestic household from the age of 7, had opinions about. She mentioned, at one point, that she thought most people who owned land had a remarkably theoretical relationship with what was actually happening on it. The general looked at her for a moment, then laughed, and said that was the most accurate thing anyone had said to him in a calendar year. Julian, across the table, caught the exchange and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. She was fine. She had always been fine. The social difficulty had been his anxiety about the Tun's reception, not about Eleanor's capacity to navigate it. This was, he reflected, a pattern he was beginning to recognise. He worried. She was fine. He should probably have predicted this, given that she was a person who had been fine in genuinely difficult circumstances for a decade. But worry operates on its own schedule and is rarely persuaded by evidence. The season proceeded. Eleanor was presented at a ball in April, a significant occasion, the kind that required preparation and a specific dress, and the particular internal composure of someone walking into a large room in which every person already knows who you are and has an opinion about it. She wore a dress that was the right dress for the occasion, and was also simply a good dress, which she thought was the correct priority. She wore her hair in the fashion of the year, which she had learned with the assistance of the lady's maid who was now part of her daily life, a woman Eleanor had initially found alarming in her expertise and had come to find genuinely interesting. She entered the ballroom. The thing about a room full of people who are watching you and know they're watching you is that you can feel it like a physical pressure. Eleanor had felt versions of this before, not in ballrooms but in her aunt's sitting room in the market, in the moments when her position as something not quite right was most visible. She knew how to stand in a pressure, upright, steady, looking at the room rather than at the floor. She looked at the room looked back, and then the first person came to speak to her, a woman of considerable standing whose name Eleanor had been told, who turned out to have an extremely specific interest in the history of the county Eleanor had come from, because her own grandmother had been born there, and this was a connection she was quite pleased to have found. They talked for 20 minutes, It was a genuine conversation. Eleanor's genuine conversations had a particular quality that people found consistently either slightly startling or very welcome, depending on their tolerance for directness, and this woman had a high tolerance for directness. By the end of the evening, 3 more people had made a point of talking to her. By the end of the week, she'd received 4 morning calls. By the end of the month, she was not a novelty anymore. She was simply someone the ton knew, which is the best possible outcome in that particular world. To stop being a story and become a person. She wrote to Julian's friend's wife after the ball and said she thought London was mostly manageable, if you remembered that the people in it were, underneath the social machinery, the same people who existed everywhere else, which is to say, a mixture of kind and unkind and anxious and curious, in roughly the same proportions as anywhere. Julian's friend's wife wrote back and said she'd been thinking that for 30 years but had never heard it put so plainly. The season also gave Eleanor her first encounter with the marriage market she'd been excluded from for 10 years, not as a participant, obviously, not anymore, but as an observer. She watched young women be assessed. She watched them perform and smile and arrange their faces around the right expressions and wait to be chosen. She watched their mothers watch them, with the specific anxiety of people who understood that their daughters' entire futures were being decided in these rooms, in these weeks, by criteria that had nothing to do with whether the daughters were interesting or capable or good. She watched all of this with the particular quality of a person who understands a system from both sides. She didn't say much about it to Julian. What she said on a Tuesday evening after a particularly elaborate assembly was that she found it difficult to watch and that she didn't know what to do with that difficulty, because she understood that the young women in those rooms were also not unhappy, most of them, and that the system produced a range of outcomes, and that her own outcome had been one of the better ones, so she wasn't entitled to a simple conclusion. Julian said he thought that was exactly the right level of complexity about it. She said she found complexity exhausting sometimes. He said, "Yes," he said, "but you manage it better than most people I know." She looked at him for a moment, the sideways look, the quick glance under slightly lowered brows that he had learned, over months of watching, meant she was deciding whether to say the thing she was thinking. She said, "I've had a great deal of practice managing things that were exhausting." He said, "I know." She said, "I'd rather not have to now." He said, "I know that too, and I would like, if you'll allow it, to be the person who makes that particular practice unnecessary." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "You do, mostly," which from Eleanor was as close to a complete declaration of contentment as you were going to get. He understood this. He was, by now, extremely good at reading the things she said in the specific register she said them. It was, by any honest assessment, an excellent marriage. Not a perfect one. They disagreed about things regularly, including about whether they were disagreeing, which had been an interesting argument to navigate, and about household finances, which Eleanor had strong opinions on from the perspective of someone who had experienced both the complete absence of them and their relative abundance, and about whether Julian spent enough time not working, which she raised periodically, and which he said he was working on, which she said was not quite the point, but excellent, the kind that improves over time, rather than settling or diminishing. The kind built on the particular foundation of 2 people who had each, separately, become quite good at existing on their own terms before they found each other, and who therefore did not require the other person to be more than they were. She went back to the original river once, in the autumn of their first year. Not for laundry. She hired a carriage and went on a Tuesday morning, which was the day she'd always been most likely to be there, and sat on the bank for an hour. The water was the same. The mist had lifted by the time she arrived, so the light was different than she remembered it from those pre-dawn hours. Fuller, more ordinary. The specific magic of the early morning already replaced by the workday world. But the stone was the same stone. The sound was the same sound. She thought about what it had been like to kneel here, and work here, and think here, in the only hour of the day that felt like hers. She thought about the version of herself who had come here not knowing that a ledger existed with her name in it, who had worked through every cold morning holding herself together with no audience and no recognition, and no particular expectation that anything would change. She sat for a while. Then she stood up, smoothed her dress, the good dress, the dress of a woman who no longer owned one dress, and walked back to the carriage. The river had been the same, she had not. There is a particular kind of strength that gets built in difficult conditions, the way certain materials only harden under pressure. Eleanor Hale had that kind of strength. What she also had, and this is the part the story usually forgets in favour of the more dramatic elements, was the capacity to put it down once it was no longer required, to stop bracing, to exist without the permanent low-level preparedness that had been her companion for 10 years. This took time. It doesn't happen the day the circumstances change. The body and the mind that have learned to expect difficulty continue expecting it for a while, long after the difficulty has gone. She woke for months, already tensed for whatever the morning would require of her. She caught herself calculating, the way she had always calculated, quietly and automatically, what was expected, what she could afford to do and what she couldn't, what the price of any given choice was likely to be. She caught herself apologizing for taking up space in rooms that were, legally and by every relevant measure, hers. Julian noticed and said nothing, and waited, and gradually, not at a speed that could be tracked or marked with a date, the bracing began to ease. She started to sit in chairs at angles that weren't economical. She started to have opinions about how rooms were decorated, and to say so, which she had never done anywhere that belonged to someone else. She started to take the long route through the garden when she had time, and to name the things she wanted for dinner rather than the things she thought would cause the least inconvenience. She started, in other words, to inhabit her own life. It was, Julian thought, watching her cross the garden on a morning in late summer, the most quietly moving thing he'd ever seen. He'd found the most genuinely interesting person he'd ever met at a river before dawn, washing clothes in cold water, and had been too tired of his own life to run the kind of calculation that would have told him to stay away. He considered this one of the better outcomes of that particular tiredness. She saw him watching and raised an eyebrow. He said, "Just looking at the garden." She said, "You're not looking at the garden." He said, "No." She looked at him for a moment, with the full attention she gave things she was actually looking at, and then she went back to crossing the garden, and that was enough, and they both knew it was enough, and the morning continued around them in the particular way mornings do when there's nothing wrong with them. There is something that Eleanor's story shares with a great many stories from this period that never got told. Eleanor was legitimate. She had a record. She had a solicitor's father who understood in his professional capacity that paper was protection and had made the paper. She had a duke who had the resources and the standing to send for the vicar and the solicitor on a Thursday afternoon and get what he asked for by Friday. She had a letter from Hannah More. She had outcomes, in other words, that depended not just on who she was, but on the specific machinery that happened to be available to her when the moment arrived. Most women in her situation did not have the machinery. There were, across Regency England, a considerable number of orphaned girls in arrangements that looked like Eleanor's, absorbed into households, doing the work of servants, occupying the undefined social space of the dependent relation, with their origins complicated or suppressed by the people who stood to benefit from the complication. The parish registers existed for all of them, in principle. The law existed. The records existed. What often didn't exist was a person with the means and the will to read the register aloud in a room where it would matter. Eleanor's story is, among other things, a story about what access to that machinery looks like, what it means to have someone in your corner who is also in a position where their being in your corner changes the outcome. She did not rescue herself from her circumstances alone. She had, for the first time in 10 years, help. The kind of help that is structural rather than charitable. The kind that operates through documented fact and legal authority rather than through sympathy. This is not a diminishment of who she was, quite the opposite. She was the person who was worth helping. She was the person who had spent 10 years being exactly herself, in conditions that rewarded being less than that, and who had arrived at the moment the help appeared still entirely intact. The interior dignity that Hannah More wrote about, the quality of a person who knows what she is even when the world around her has decided not to notice, cannot be installed from outside. It's either there or it isn't. In Eleanor, it had been there from the beginning, and 10 years of suppression hadn't touched it. That was her doing. Everything else was circumstances aligning, her father making the record surviving, Julian being tired of the right things at the right time and choosing the right river on the right morning, the machinery finding her when it did. She thought about this in the later years. Not often. She was not, by temperament, a person who spent a great deal of time in retrospect, preferring the actual texture of the present to the reconstruction of the past. But occasionally, when something in the world around her echoed back to those 10 years, when she met a girl in a situation that reminded her, when she heard of a case in which the records existed and nobody had looked, when she read something in a newspaper about the conditions of domestic service in the great houses, she thought about it. She became, in the later years of her marriage, someone who asked questions about the staff. Not intrusive questions. Not the kind that embarrassed people. The practical kind. Was the work distributed fairly? Was there adequate time between tasks? Were the quarters warm? She asked the housekeeper these things directly and listened to the answers, and when the answers indicated something was not right, she said so, and it was changed. This produced, over time, a household with a reputation for being a place where people were treated as if they mattered, which, in the Regency period, was not guaranteed, and which had the practical effect of attracting capable staff who then stayed. The house ran well. Julian, who had largely left the domestic management to the housekeeper before Eleanor arrived, discovered that a well-run house and an interestingly run house were not always the same thing, and that Eleanor's version was both. He said this to her once. She said she didn't see why they had to be different things. He said that in his experience they often were. She said his experience prior to her had covered a narrower range of options than he might think. He said he was aware. There were children, eventually. 2 of them. A daughter first and then a son. Though Eleanor said privately to Julian's friend's wife that she thought the conventional preference for sons, in this country, had a great deal to answer for, and that she intended to raise both of them with equal access to her opinions, which Julian's friend's wife said was probably the most subversive parenting philosophy she'd heard expressed in a drawing room. Eleanor said it wasn't subversive. It was simply accurate. The daughter grew up to have opinions of her own, in volume and precision, which Eleanor regarded as a successful outcome, and Julian regarded as something he should probably have predicted. The son grew up somewhat quieter, which Julian regarded as evidence that some qualities skipped generations, and Eleanor said was more likely evidence that the daughter had taken up all available conversational space since approximately age 3. They lived at Roshmire most of the year. They went to London for the season, and Julian managed his estates, and Eleanor did the things that a Duchess of Roshmire was expected to do, and did them well, and also did several things that a Duchess of Roshmire was not specifically expected to do, including corresponding with Hannah More until More died in 1833, and attending on 2 occasions sessions of a charitable organisation dedicated to the welfare of orphaned children in the parish system. She did not speak publicly about her own history at these sessions. She didn't need to. The people running the organisation knew who she was. They understood, without it being said, that she was there because she understood the inside of the subject rather than only the outside. She was, in all the ways that mattered, exactly the person she'd always been. She was also, for the first time in her adult life, the person that the world around her had finally arranged itself to accommodate. Seen, known, called by her correct name, in rooms that were hers, by people who were there because they wanted to be. She was 27 years old the first time she sat in the drawing room at Roshmere and understood, with the complete bodily certainty rather than just the intellectual knowledge, that she was allowed to be here, that this was home, that no one was going to come to the door with a different accounting of who she was. Julian was reading across the room. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. What does it mean? To be seen. Not noticed. Seen. The distinction matters. Eleanor had been noticed by her aunt as a resource and a problem. She'd been noticed by the county as an anomaly when the Duke's interest became known. She'd been noticed by the ton as an interesting story. Noticed is what the world does to you from the outside. It counts you. It catalogues you. It measures you against its existing categories and decides where you fit. Being seen is something different. Being seen is what happened at the river on the 4th morning, when Julian sat on the bank and listened to her say that ordinary things had their uses, and instead of waiting for the gap in the conversation to fill it with something about himself, he asked what she meant. It's a small thing, asking what someone means. It costs almost nothing. But in a world that mostly operates on the assumption that it already knows what you mean, or doesn't particularly need to, the act of asking is not small at all. She had spent 17 years in a world that had decided it already knew what she meant. The specific damage this does is quiet, but cumulative. When the world around you has determined in advance what you are, when you are consistently received as the category rather than the person, as the orphan rather than Eleanor, as the servant rather than the woman with very precise opinions about the nature of obligation, you develop over time a relationship with your own interior life that is somewhat privatized. You have the thoughts, but you stop expecting them to be received. You have the opinions, but you stop offering them, because offering them produces no result except occasionally irritating the people who've already decided what you are. Julian had asked what she meant. That was the beginning. What followed? The months at the river, the exposure, the letter, the legal defence, the wedding, the drawing rooms, the garden, the children, the correspondence with Hannah More, the long years at Roshmire with the organised river that was not as interesting as the wild one. What followed was the consequence of that single act of genuine attention. One person deciding to ask. one person deciding to listen to the answer, one person deciding, when the world complicated the situation, to use the resources at his disposal not to manage the complication but to resolve it. Eleanor Hale had always been exactly who she was. What changed was simply that the world finally found out. There are other Eleanor Hales in the historical record of this period. Not by that name. We don't know their names, most of them, because the historical record does not tend to preserve the names of people who remained unrescued. But they are visible in the aggregate, in the poor law records, in the parish accounts, in the reports of charitable organisations, in the household records of estates where dependent relations are listed without wages, and without marriage prospects and without futures. Girls who had parish records that proved exactly who they were. Girls whose legitimacy was documented in ink that didn't fade. Girls for whom no one sent for the vicar on a Thursday afternoon. Their stories are also real. They are the reason Eleanor's matters. Not because her ending was happy. Happy endings are pleasant to land in, but not, by themselves, significant. Because her beginning was ordinary. Because nothing about what happened to her was unusual until the moment someone unusual happened to notice her. And because the quality that made her worth noticing, the interior dignity, the steadiness, the precise and genuine thinking, the complete self-possession, was never the product of her circumstances. It was hers. It had always been hers. Her circumstances had simply hidden it from everyone except the river. The river saw it first. The river had been seeing it every morning for years, long before Julian Ashborne rode past. And now, at last, the world had caught up. There is a season in England, between the end of summer and the real arrival of autumn, when the mornings carry a particular quality. The light comes sideways and gold across the landscape. The rivers run slower and cleaner than they did in spring. The fields have already given what they were going to give, and everything is in the process of becoming something quieter, something that contains winter rather than resisting it. Eleanor loved this season, not because it was beautiful, though it was, because it was the season when the river at dawn looked most like she remembered it. The mist sitting lower, the cold more honest, the bird's song already thinning to the few species that stayed through the winter. She had spent more mornings at more rivers in her life than she could count, and the ones she returned to in memory were almost always in this season, in this light, in this particular quality of cold. She thought, sometimes, about what she'd been thinking on those mornings, what she'd been thinking at 17, kneeling at a stone and working through wet linen in the pre-dawn quiet, in the hour that belonged only to her. She could reconstruct some of it. The practical calculations, what needed to be done, what she could and couldn't afford to want. The quiet inventory of what she knew to be true about herself, that the world around her seemed to have decided didn't matter. The specific discipline of maintaining, in the absence of any audience, the self that would otherwise have been crowded out by the accumulated pressure of being treated as less than you were. She had not known on those mornings that the inventory would eventually matter, that keeping it was not an exercise in futile self-preservation, but an investment in a future that was not yet visible. She had simply kept it because it was hers, and she was not willing to give it up, and sometimes that is all the reason required. Julian found her once, in that in-between season, standing at the edge of the Roshmere River before dawn. He had not been able to sleep, a common enough occurrence for a man with 11,000 acres and a mind that treated problems as things to be solved overnight, and had come downstairs to find her coat already gone from the hook. He found her at the river's edge, not working, not sitting, just standing. Her hands were at her sides. Her face was turned toward the water. The mist was on the surface, and the birds had just begun, and the whole scene had the quality of a held breath. He stood at a distance. He didn't speak. After a while she said, without turning, "I know you're there." He said, "I know," she said. "It's different here. The river." He said, "Yes." She said, "Not worse, just different. This one is managed. The other one was just itself." He said, "I know." She turned around then and looked at him in the particular way she had. Full attention, no performance. The face that had first arrested him on a different bank in a different county, 20 years ago now, and that had, in the 2 decades since, never entirely stopped surprising him with the quality of its attention. She said, "Do you ever miss the one we were at? The first one?" He said, "Sometimes." He said, "Mostly I miss the specific thing that was happening at it." She said, "What was happening at it?" He said, "I was finding out what it felt like to talk to someone who didn't know my title and didn't want anything from me, and said exactly what she thought." She said, "And now you get that at breakfast." He said, "I do." She said, "The river was better at dawn, though." He said, "Yes." She turned back to the water. He walked down to stand beside her. They stood at the Roshmere River in the in-between season, before the house woke, before the day made its demands, in the particular companionable quiet of 2 people who'd been talking honestly to each other for 20 years and were not finished. The mist sat on the water. The birds continued. The morning assembled itself around them, piece by piece, the way mornings do. That is where we leave them, standing at the river's edge, in the in-between season, in the particular quiet of a world that has finally arranged itself correctly. It is not a dramatic image. There is no crisis in it, no tension, no unresolved question. Just 2 people and a river and a morning that belongs to both of them. That is, in itself, the point. Eleanor Hale's story is not, when you look at it carefully, a story about what she gained. The title, the estate, the London season, the 47 rooms. Those are the visible outcomes, and they matter, and they are real, and she deserved them and then some. But the story underneath the story, the one that was happening at the river every morning for years before anyone else arrived to witness it, is about what she never lost. The thing her aunt's silence couldn't suppress, and the whisper campaign couldn't touch, and 10 years of enforced invisibility couldn't erode. The quality that was simply there, in the cold and the early morning and the lye-burned hands, the same on the last day at the river as it had been on the first. There is something in that, if you let it settle. Something about what it means to know what you are, even when the world hasn't caught up yet. About the specific patience of continuing to be yourself, in the absence of any audience, any recognition, any practical reason for it. About the fact that the record, the literal paper record, the ink in the ledger, the documented truth of who you are, doesn't need to be looked at to be real. It's there whether anyone reads it or not. Eleanor knew that. Not always consciously. Not always with the philosophical neatness that distance lends to things, but in the way that matters more, in the pre-dawn mornings when she got up and went to the river because the work was there and the hour was hers, and she brought her full self to both without apology. That was hers. That was always hers. To understand what Eleanor's life meant, not just as a story, but as a fact of the world she was living in, it helps to understand what the world was doing to the women around her in those same years. The early 19th century in England was, for women in domestic service, a period of considerable invisible labour and considerable invisible suffering. There are numbers that give you a sense of the scale, and then there is the reality behind the numbers, which is always harder to hold. By the 1820s, domestic service was the single largest occupation for women in England. More women worked as servants than in any other paid capacity. They woke before dawn in cold attic rooms. They carried coal and water and linens. They boiled and scrubbed and hauled. They did this 6, sometimes 7 days a week, in exchange for wages that by modern calculation amount to something very small, for rooms that were often damp or unheated, in positions that required their complete personal availability with very little corresponding regard for their personal existence. The good households were different. That phrase, the good households, is one that appears frequently in the accounts of women who survived domestic service and wrote about it later. The distinction was not about wages exactly, and not about physical conditions exactly. It was about whether the people who employed you treated you as someone who existed, whether they asked your name and remembered it, whether they noticed when you were unwell that you were unwell, whether the work was distributed in a way that acknowledged it was being done by a human body and not a mechanism. Eleanor had not been in a good household. She had been in a household that had found the line between bad and merely insufficient, and stayed carefully on the insufficient side, which is in some ways harder to survive than outright cruelty. Outright cruelty produces clarity. Insufficiency produces a kind of slow erosion, the gradual narrowing of what you expect, what you ask for, what you believe you're owed. Eleanor had spent 10 years managing that erosion by maintaining, in the private accounting of her early mornings at the river, a very clear record of what she was actually worth versus what the world around her was currently willing to acknowledge. That record, the one inside her head, not the one in the church ledger, was the thing that had survived intact. There's a particular irony in the fact that the same quality that had made her insufferable to her aunt, the steadiness, the composure, the refusal to be smaller than she was exactly the quality that had caught Julian Ashbourne's attention on a cold morning at a river. The aunt had spent 10 years trying to suppress it. Julian had spent 5 minutes being arrested by it. This is, in the end, what tends to happen to qualities like that. They don't diminish under pressure, they wait. Eleanor understood this about herself by the time she was in her 30s. She understood it with the retrospective clarity that comes when you can finally see the full arc of a thing. She didn't speak about it often. It was not the kind of understanding that improved from being said out loud too frequently. But she carried it, and it shaped the way she moved through the world that was now hers, and particularly the way she moved through the rooms of that world that contained people whose situations reminded her of where she'd been. The orphaned girl she encountered at a church event in the county, in the 3rd year of her marriage, 12 years old, placed by the parish with a family in the next town, sitting very still in the pew with the particular stillness of someone who has learned to take up as little space as possible. Eleanor sat next to her and asked her name. The girl said it very quietly, as if unsure she was supposed to have one in that room. Eleanor told her that it was a good name. She asked what she liked to do when she had time. The girl said she liked to read, when there were books to read from, which wasn't often. Eleanor said she'd arrange for some books to be sent. She did that afternoon. She told Julian about it that evening. He said, "She reminded you of yourself." Eleanor said, "Yes." He said, "What will you do about it?" Eleanor said she didn't know yet, but that she thought the question was the right one to be asking, and that she'd continue to ask it. She asked it, in various forms for the rest of her life. She was not by temperament a person who built institutions. She was not a reformer in the grand public sense. She didn't write pamphlets or organize societies or campaign for legislative change, though she had opinions about all of these things and occasionally expressed them in letters that the recipients did not always know what to do with. What she did was smaller than that, and probably more reliable. She paid attention. She used the resources at her disposal, which were by this point the resources of a duchess, which is to say considerable, to address specific situations when they arose, and to make specific changes in specific rooms. The housekeeper at Rochmore Hall, who had been managing the household for 20 years before Eleanor arrived, said in her old age that the change in the house in the first decade of Eleanor's management was the most significant change she had witnessed in her career. Not because the standards dropped, they didn't. Because they deepened. Because the house moved from being well run in the sense of smooth and efficient to being well run in the sense of genuinely good. The staff knew the difference. Staff always know the difference because they are the ones who feel it. This is not a small thing. A household that employs 22 people is a small world, and the conditions in that world matter to the people living in it. The laundry maid who didn't have to work through a fever because Eleanor noticed and said something. The footman who was given a Saturday afternoon to visit his family in the next county rather than being expected to remain on call through his day off. The kitchen maid who received a book from the household library, which no one had previously thought to offer her, and who read it in her cold room in the attic, and who became— this is the detail that Eleanor would have appreciated most— a reader for the rest of her life. These things radiated outward, not dramatically, not in ways that make it into the historical record mostly, but the household was different because Eleanor was in it, and the people in the household were different because the household was different, and they took those differences with them when they eventually moved on to other positions and other houses and brought some of those differences to wherever they went. That is how quiet change works. Not in declarations and not in public gestures, in the specific quality of the attention you bring to the rooms you're in and the people you're in them with. Eleanor had been practicing that quality at a river every morning for 10 years before anyone noticed. The river hadn't needed her to be noticed to be what it was. The river had simply been there, cold and still, and the same every morning regardless of what was happening in the house behind it. There is something steadying about that, when you're the person at the river's edge, the knowledge that the water doesn't require anything of you, that it will be here tomorrow whether you come back to it or not, that it has been here before you and will be here after you, and holds no particular opinion about what you decide to do on its banks. Eleanor had found that steadying on all the mornings when nothing else was. Julian, standing beside her at the Rochmire River in the in-between season, had begun to understand this too. Not the same river, he had his own, but the same quality. The thing you find when you get up before dawn and go to where the water is and stand in the quiet with your thoughts not yet organised into the day's requirements. He had been finding it at rivers since before he could account for why, and Eleanor had been the person who finally named it for him, not in words exactly, but in the way she was at the original river. The way that told him this was a place where the self could simply be present without performing anything. They had both needed that, in their different ways. They had found it at the same water. What the years made of Eleanor Hale in the end was something she might not have been able to name at 17, but would have recognised immediately, because it was what she'd always been reaching for in those early mornings without knowing what to call it. A person in the right place, not the place society would have put her, had society been left to arrange things on its own. Society would have put her in a kitchen, in an attic room, in the perpetual background of someone else's life. But the right place in the deeper sense, the place where who she was and where she was aligned, where the interior life and the exterior circumstances finally told the same story. That alignment is not guaranteed to anyone. It's worth saying that plainly. The world does not owe it to you. There are people, many people in Eleanor's era and in every era, for whom the alignment never comes, for whom the internal and the external remain in permanent disagreement, because the external is immovable, or because the machinery that might have resolved it was never available. Eleanor had the machinery. Her father had made part of it. Julian had deployed another part. The parish register had provided the rest. Without any one of those elements, the story ends differently. She thought about this on certain mornings at the organised river, and was careful not to confuse gratitude with inevitability. She had not been inevitable. She had been possible. There was a meaningful difference. What she had done with the possibility, the decade of careful self-preservation, the morning accounting at the cold river, the steadiness that had made her recognisable to someone who was looking for steadiness, that was hers. Everything else had depended on circumstances lining up in a specific way, and she was honest enough to know that, and grateful enough to not take it as given. She was also, in the later years, someone who spoke to her children about it, not in the form of a cautionary tale and not in the form of a triumph, in the form of a fact that the world is not arranged fairly, and that this creates an obligation in those to whom it has been more generous, and that the obligation is not discharged by sympathy alone but requires something more specific: attention, action, the willingness to notice who is in the background of a room and to ask their name. The daughter listened to this with the particular intensity of a child who takes ideas seriously. The son listened with the particular attention of a child who is trying to understand why his mother's voice sounds different when she says this than when she says other things. Neither of them forgot it. Julian, who overheard this conversation from the hallway and did not announce himself, stood for a moment with his hand on the doorframe and thought about a river and a woman who had not looked up, and about how much of the rest of his life had been consequence of that morning. He was not by temperament a sentimental man. He did not believe on the whole in fate or in providential arrangement. He believed in choices and their consequences, in the accumulation of specific actions into something that could be called a life. He had ridden past that river for the first time because of a property dispute, and an inn that was adequate and a morning that was clear. Eleanor had been there because of work and an hour that was hers and a decade of practice at being herself in the cold. Neither of them had chosen the other in that first moment. They had simply been there. Everything after that had been choice. He came into the room. Eleanor looked up. He sat down. The children continued with whatever they'd been doing. The afternoon continued. The house continued around them, in the particular way of houses that are genuinely inhabited rather than merely occupied, full of sound and motion and small specific life, all of it belonging to them, all of it real. And now, if you're still with us, wherever you are, whatever time it is there, let this part of the evening be yours. You've been travelling with Eleanor for a while now. You know the shape of her world. The cold stone and the still water and the sound of the current in the early morning before anything else has begun. Let that world become a room. Let your body settle into whatever it's resting against right now. The weight of you sinking gently, the breath coming and going on its own without any assistance from you. You've been carrying the story. You can put it down now. It doesn't go anywhere. Picture the river. before the world woke, before the house stirred, before the birds had found their full voice and the mist had made up its mind about rising. The water is still. The stone under her hands is cold and solid and entirely itself. She is entirely herself. The morning is assembling around her, quietly, the way mornings do when you don't hurry them. The linen moves, the water moves. She does not need to. There is a ledger on a shelf, in a church, in a market town not far from here. Inside it is her name, her father's name, the date of their marriage, the date of her birth, all of it in ink that has been patient for 17 years, and will be patient for 17 more and beyond that, because ink doesn't require anything. It simply is. She simply is. Your breath is slower now. There's nothing required of it. The river is still. The stone is cold. The birds are building their sound, one note, then another. The world becoming itself in the way that it always does. Not all at once, not dramatically, just note by note and breath by breath, until the morning is there without you having had to do anything to make it arrive. That is the river before the world woke. Still water, cold stone, her hands steady. Let her hold it for you now, whatever you've been carrying into this night, whatever it is that's been occupying the space behind your eyes. The river holds things. It moves past them. It doesn't require them to resolve before morning. Neither do you. There's a woman at the river, in the quiet, in the early dark before the first grey begins. She knows what she is. She knows it without anyone having told her recently. She knows it the way the stone knows what it is, not by thinking about it, but by simply being it, in the cold and the dark and the moving water. She's been there every morning. She'll be there in the morning. The water is still. The mist is low. Your breath is quieter now, and the room around you is quieter too, and the night is doing what nights do when you finally let them, settling, deepening, becoming the particular dark that leads to sleep. That's enough. Eleanor's at the river. The record's in the ledger. The morning's coming. Sleep now. It'll still be there when you wake.